refused. He was a very integritous man in these regards. He absolutely refused. And so one day his Twin Otter plane, the presidential plane, blew up, and he was killed. And I was waiting for it to happen. This is the way the Jackals do things, and there was a lot of evidence that a tape recorder that he'd been given before the plane took off was a bomb. There's no question in my mind, and there's no question in a lot of the minds of a lot of the investigators throughout South America. People knew that this was a CIA orchestrated assassination. Of course, it hardly made our press. And next, Noriega took over. And Noriega was not an Omar Torrijos by any means. He was a much more corrupt individual. He had a lot of very unpleasant personal habits. He was not charismatic, but he stuck to his guns to a large degree. He too refused to give up negotiating with the Japanese. He refused to renegotiate the Canal Treaty. He refused to allow the American military bases to stay. They left and went to Ecuador. So as an upshot of that, of course, we invaded Panama in 1989. 2,000 to 3,000 Panamanians, innocent civilians, were killed in the process, and Noriega was taken prisoner and still sits in a prison in Miami, Florida.
Did you ever hear firsthand about using the Jackals if you guys failed in your endeavors? Was that something that Claudine had told you about, or I mean, how do you know that for sure?
Yeah, Claudine did tell me about that. It was one of the motivating forces for me to do a good job, and all of us, economic hitmen. We didn't want to see the Jackals come in. I sure did not want to see Omar Torrijos assassinated. So it was an inspiration for us. It was one of the things that concerned me when I worked out this deal with Omar, to really do the real job rather than an economic hitman job. And I talk about this extensively in Confessions of an Economic Hitman, that at one point I got very concerned that Torrijos, that, all right, I'm going along with what he's saying and I'm happy that I'm doing it, but what's the implications for him and ultimately for me? We knew the Jackals were always there lurking in the shadows, and it was a tremendous push for us to do what we were supposed to do and do it efficiently so they wouldn't have to come in. They're very much a part of the system, and I knew a number of them personally, and I still do. I know a couple of them who are now in Iraq.
And do they work through U.S. governmental organizations like the CIA? And I ask that because we're looking at more and more in this day and age where private contractors, at least for military operations, are being used, the DynCorp, things like that.
Correct. That's how they work. The Jackals, the Jackals that I know are never CIA employees. They work for companies like Executive Solutions, companies with names like this. I'm not even sure they got the names right, but Global Alternatives. Most of these companies, incidentally, are offshore companies. They're British or Australian. They're not U.S. companies. So the people who work for them don't pay U.S. taxes. They don't pay any taxes. I have a good friend who's a Jackal who's in Iraq today. He's been in this business for years. He's making over $300,000 a year tax-free. And they, of course, they're not paid by the Defense Department. They're usually paid, the companies get contracts with the State Department or some other organization, so they don't even show up on the books. We have thousands of people in Iraq today that are being sent in by private corporations this way that aren't on our military books. If they die, they're not included in the statistics. When they kill people, those people aren't included in the statistics. They're not in the budgets for the military, and they're not prohibited from doing the things that our military is prohibited by law from doing, such as torture. They're doing it, and they do it as private contractors. It's a huge business. Most of them came out of our military. They came out of Ranger units, Special Forces units. They're owned by and run by those people. Some of them came out of those kinds of units in other countries, as South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, England, France, but a lot of them come out of our own military.
Yeah, I know with Halliburton, one of your former company's competitors, they have numerous offshore holdings that they like to transfer their profits to, as well as of several months ago, the number of Halliburton employees who had been killed in Iraq was, I believe, at about 45. And that's not something you read about in the papers.
Right, and those are Halliburton employees. There's a lot of other people who work for Halliburton that wouldn't be classified as employees, that don't even make those kinds of statistics. And that's true in the industry, as is bribing. You know, great subject, bribing, because there's a number of newspaper articles out now about the fact that funds are unaccounted for. There's been scandals over the fact that a company like Halliburton or Bechtel or any of these companies that they spent $1 million for fuel or Coca-Cola or something else when they really should have only spent $600,000. You know, there's that kind of thing. And I think a lot of people, when they read an article like that, they say, my God, well, I guess somebody in one of these companies was making $400,000 then by cheating the company, his own company. I mean, people, I wonder, you know, what people do think. Whereas to me, it's very obvious. These kinds of monies are being used as bribes. This is as old as history. Our companies are prohibited by law from bribing people outright. I can't go in and say, I want to win this contract, Mike, so, you know, here's $400,000. Make sure I get the contract. That's very illegal, and it's almost never done by U.S. companies. It is done by companies from other countries where it's not illegal or not as illegal. But our companies don't do that, and they pride themselves on their integrity for not doing that. Instead, what they do is they'll, if I want to bribe you, if you're president, I want to bribe you, I want to give you $400,000. I'll say, well, do you have a brother or a friend who owns the John Deere franchise in this country? And you say yes, and so I'll negotiate a deal with that person to rent his equipment. I'll rent $600,000 worth of his equipment, and I'll pay $1 million. And there's nothing illegal about that. I can always fall back and say, "Oh my God, I didn't know I could have got it for $600,000. I cut a bad deal. How stupid of me." But it's obvious then that the side agreement is that extra $400,000 will go to you, the president. This happens all the time. At Charles T. Maine, our offices were filled with young men and women, but mainly men, from the countries where we worked, whose fathers were very high up in the governments. And we brought these young men in as interns at Charles T. Maine, paid them quite well, and in addition to that, we arranged for them to go to college in the United States, in Boston, at MIT or Harvard or Northeastern or BU or BC or wherever they could get in, and we could help them get in. We would usually give them a full scholarship or make sure they got one. We might pay for their housing and their food and give them a very nice salary as interns. So they might benefit to the tune of $50,000 a year, something along these lines, that really was a bribe to their parents, and yet there was nothing illegal about it. So much of this stuff that's done that is immoral, I think it's unethical, I think it really should be illegal, but the way it's done, it's legitimate, because the laws are written to protect this system, to protect what I call the corporatocracy, the big business, big banks, and government people who are running this empire.
Well, more and more it sounds like the laws are literally written by lobbyists from companies like the company that you worked for. Was there talk of that while you were in there, of tweaking legislation to create loopholes so your company could drive through those?
All of these companies have lobbyists in one form or another that are deeply involved in this. Some of the information that's come out at Vanity Fair and a number of other magazines did some and U.S. News and World Report did a very deep investigation of the Saudi relationship with our government back about a year ago. And, one of the things they found was that billions of dollars had come from Saudi Arabia to pay for lobbyists and to pay off former CIA employees, government officials, congressmen, Pentagon officials. This was all documented in those magazines, and it's footnoted in my book. And if someone's looking for a reference, they can go directly to those magazines. Of course, it doesn't surprise me in the least bit, but it's a very, very corrupt system, and corruption can be done in extremely subtle ways.